The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the quiet suburban streets in a serene glow. Willow Lane, in the heart of Westfield, Indiana, was the kind of neighborhood where kids played freely and families waved to each other from their porches. But for Derek Reynolds, the peaceful evening was about to take a dark and unexpected turn. Derek tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his well-worn sedan. On the passenger seat lay a neatly wrapped gift bag, its delicate bow slightly askew from the drive. Inside was a bracelet he had carefully chosen for his daughter, Kira, who would be turning 9 the next day. He could already picture her bright smile when she opened it, and laughter lighting up the small living room they shared. After a grueling shift at the factory, the thought of Kira's excitement had carried him through the day. But as Derek turned onto the street, his heart sank. Flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror, followed by the sharp wail of a siren. Confused, he eased the car to the side of the road. He wasn't speeding. His taillights were working. His license and registration were up to date. So, why was he being pulled over? Derek's chest tightened as he rolled down his window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit born of caution and hard-learned lessons. The officer approached briskly, his expression hard and unyielding. Derek noted the man's sharp movements and the uncertain way his hand hovered near his belt. License and registration, the officer barked, his tone clipped and impatient. Derek complied without hesitation, passing the documents through the window. The officer barely glanced at them before asking, "Where are you headed?" "Just heading home," Derek replied, his voice calm but firm. "I picked up a gift for my daughter." The officer's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile, but his eyes remained cold. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Derek froze for a moment, his mind racing. This wasn't a standard traffic stop. He could feel it in the air. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, careful to keep his hands visible. The officer motioned him toward the curb, his tone brooking no argument. The quiet evening seemed to hold its breath as the officer circled Derek's car, his flashlight probing every corner. Derek stood by the curb, his pulse quickening. From behind closed blinds and parted curtains, neighbors watched, their shadows flitting like ghosts in the dim light. "What's going on, officer?" Derek asked, striving to keep his voice steady. "I wasn't speeding and my paperwork is in order." "You look suspicious," the officer replied bluntly. "We've had reports of break-ins in this area." Derek's stomach churned at the familiar, loaded accusation. He had heard it before, aimed at others who looked like him. He fought to keep his composure, knowing how quickly a situation like this could spiral out of control. "With all due respect, sir, I've done nothing wrong," he said. The officer ignored him, his attention now focused on the gift bag in the passenger seat. He pulled it out, inspecting its contents as if it were contraband. Derek's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, aware of the growing crowd gathering at the edge of the scene. Some bystanders whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and unease. Others held up their phones, recording every moment. The tension in the air was thick, every second stretching endlessly. "Is this necessary?" Derek asked again, louder this time, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Keep quiet," the officer snapped, his finger pointing menacingly at Derek. "Let me do my job." The officer's words only seemed to inflame the onlookers. Murmurs turned into angry whispers. A woman in the crowd called out, "This doesn't look right." A younger man echoed, "He's not doing anything wrong." As the officer rummaged through Derek's car, tossing aside the carefully wrapped gift bag, Derek felt a mix of humiliation and anger. His mind flashed to Kira, waiting for him at home. He had promised her he wouldn't be late. What would he tell her if he didn't make it back in time? The officer slammed the car door shut and turned back to Derek. His flashlight now pointed directly at his face. "What are you really doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusing. "I told you," Derek replied, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "I was buying a gift for my daughter. That's all. You expect me to believe that?" The officer stepped closer, the space between them narrowing. Derek raised his hands slightly, palms outward, a gesture of both submission and frustration. "Don't move," the officer barked, though Derek hadn't taken a step. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their unease transforming into anger. Then from the edge of the crowd, a single voice cut through the chaos. Clear, calm, and unwavering, it carried an authority that turned every head. "Officer, I know this man." The officer froze, his grip on the flashlight tightening. Derek turned his head, recognizing the voice. It was Miss Linda Palmer, a teacher from Kira's school. Dressed in a simple cardigan and jeans, her presence exuded quiet strength. "I know him," she repeated, stepping forward. "This man is Derek Reynolds. He's a parent of one of my students, and he's not a threat." The crowd buzzed with whispers as Derek felt a wave of relief and gratitude. But as Miss Palmer's words hum in the air, the officer's jaw tightened, his authority now challenged in front of a growing audience. What happened next would leave everyone stunned. The air seemed to thicken as Linda Palmer's voice settled over the tense scene. The officer turned sharply toward her, his stern expression faltering just slightly. His grip on his belt relaxed, though his stance remained firm. The crowd shifted, their attention drawn to the teacher who had stepped forward with such confidence. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," the officer said, his tone still authoritative, but now tinged with hesitation. "Step back." Linda didn't move. She met the officer's gaze without flinching, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm not interfering, officer. I'm here to ensure nothing unjust happens tonight. This man is part of our community, and I know him to be a good father and a hard-working citizen." Derek's heart pounded as he stood silently by the curb, his hands still raised slightly. He hadn't expected anyone to come to his defense, let alone someone like Linda. He had only met her a handful of times at school events, yet here she was, risking confrontation to stand up for him. The weight of her words wasn't lost on him, but he knew it might not be enough to defuse the situation. The officer's jaw tightened, and he glanced at the growing crowd. More people had gathered now, their murmurs becoming louder. The glowing screens of recording phones were everywhere, capturing each movement and word. The officer seemed to realize this wasn't a scene he could control as easily as he'd hoped. "Sir," Linda continued, her voice steady, "I'm sure you're just doing your job. But there's no reason to escalate this. Derek has complied with everything you've asked. He's shown his license, his registration. You've searched his car. What else are you looking for?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked from Linda to Derek and back to the crowd, his authority visibly slipping under the weight of so many watchful eyes. "Ma'am, I'm not escalating anything. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I'm following up." "Suspicious activity?" Linda repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "What's suspicious about a man driving home with a gift for his daughter?" The officer's hesitation was palpable now. Derek could see it in the way the man's shoulders tensed, how his eyes darted from Linda to the crowd and back to him. He realized the officer wasn't just wrestling with his own pride. He was also trying to salvage the perception of control. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Their murmurs were growing louder, their disapproval more evident. "This doesn't look right," someone called out from the back of the crowd. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Another voice chimed in, "Why are you still holding him here?" "Let the man go." Derek's pulse quickened. The collective anger of the onlookers was building, and while their support was a source of comfort, it also added to the tension. He glanced at Linda, who stood unwavering beside him, and then back at the officer, whose face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "Officer," Derek said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but firm. "I've complied with everything you've asked. You've searched my car, and you've seen my identification. There's nothing suspicious here. I'm just trying to get home to my daughter." The officer's eyes flicked to Derek, narrowing slightly. For a moment, it seemed as though he might dig in, double down on his authority. But the weight of the crowd, the phones, and Linda's steady presence seemed to give him pause. His hand hovered near his radio, but he didn't reach for it. Fine, the officer said finally, his voice clipped. But next time, don't make yourself look suspicious. The words stung more than Derek expected, but he bit back a response. This wasn't the time to let anger take over. He nodded silently, his jaw tight, as the officer turned and strode back to his patrol car. The crowd erupted in a mix of applause and jeers, their frustration spilling over as the tension broke. Derek exhaled slowly, lowering his hands. He felt Linda's hand on his arm, a gentle and grounding presence amidst the chaos. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice betrayed the wariness he felt. "Thanks to you." Linda nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This isn't over, Derek. What happened here tonight isn't right, and people need to know." The crowd began to disperse, but the energy lingered. Neighbors, who had once been strangers, exchanged words of solidarity, their shared frustration forging connections. A young man approached Derek, his phone in hand. "I've got it all on video," he said. "This needs to go public." Derek hesitated. Part of him wanted nothing more than to put the night behind him, to forget the humiliation and fear. But another part of him knew that wasn't possible. This wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. He nodded. "Do what you think is right." Linda gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. "You're not alone in this," she said. "We'll figure out what to do next." As Derek climbed back into his car, he glanced at the gift bag on the passenger seat. The bag was undone, the delicate bracelet now partially exposed. He thought of Kira waiting for him at home, her excitement for her birthday undone by the night's events. He started the engine, the quiet came a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just moments earlier. As he drove away, Derek couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. The officer's words, the crowd's support, Linda's bravery, all of it swirled in his mind, a mix of anger, gratitude, and exhaustion. He knew the night would stay with him for a long time, but what he didn't know was just how far its impact would reach. As Derek pulled into his driveway, he turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment. The night had left a mark on him deeper than he wanted to admit. His reflection in the rearview mirror showed tired eyes, a face trying to mask the storm of emotions swirling within. But there was no time to dwell on it. Kira was waiting for him, and tonight he needed to be her strong and steady father, not a man shaken by what he'd endured. When he opened the front door, Kira ran toward him, her smile wide and full of life. "Daddy, did you get my surprise?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. Derek knelt down, forcing a smile as he handed her the gift bag. "I did, sweetheart. Happy early birthday." She squealed with joy, taking the bag and carefully pulling out the bracelet. Her face glowed as she held it up to the light. "It's perfect, Daddy. Thank you." Her happiness was a balm to his frayed nerves, but as he hugged her tightly, Derek couldn't help but think about the ugly reality of the world outside their home. Kira deserved a life free from fear, one where moments like tonight were unimaginable. He'd promised himself long ago to protect her from that darkness. But how could he shield her from a world that could so easily turn against them? Later that evening, after Kira had gone to bed, Derek sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. The young man from the crowd had already sent him the video, and it was quickly gaining traction online. Comments and shares were pouring in, a mix of outrage, support, and heated debates. He scrolled through them, his emotions a complicated tangle of validation and frustration. Linda had also reached out, sending him a message to check on him, and offering to connect him with local community groups. He appreciated her kindness, but the thought of reliving the night over and over in discussions or meetings made his stomach turn. Still, he knew avoiding it wasn't an option. What had happened wasn't just his burden. It was part of a larger issue that couldn't be ignored. The next day, Derek found himself at the center of a whirlwind. Calls from reporters started coming in, each wanting his account of what had happened. His name and face were suddenly everywhere, tied to headlines about police misconduct and racial bias. While some of the attention was supportive, not all of it was positive. Comments on social media ranged from encouraging words to cruel accusations, questioning his actions, and even his character. Derek struggled to process it all. He wasn't a man used to being in the spotlight, and now every move he made seemed to be under a microscope. At work, his co-workers gave him sympathetic looks, but he could feel the tension in their glances. Everyone wanted to talk about it, to offer their opinions, but Derek just wanted to do his job and go home. Meanwhile, the local police department issued a brief statement acknowledging the incident and stating that an internal investigation was underway. To Derek, it felt like a hollow gesture, more about damage control than genuine accountability. The officer from that night hadn't been named publicly, and there was no indication of any real consequences. Linda, however, refused to let the issue fade. She organized a community meeting at the school, inviting residents, local leaders, and even representatives from the police department to attend. When she called Derek to ask if he'd speak, he hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a crowd, recounting the humiliation he felt, was daunting. But Linda's words stuck with him. This isn't just about what happened to you, Derek. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Your voice matters. On the night of the meeting, the school's gymnasium was packed. Derek walked in, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on him. He spotted Linda near the front, giving him a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. He started slowly, recounting the events of that night, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to rise. As he spoke, he glanced at the audience, seeing a mix of anger, empathy, and determination in their faces. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. But not everyone was supportive. Toward the back of the room, a man stood up, his voice cutting through the noise. What about the officer's side of the story? Are we just going to assume he was wrong without knowing all the facts? The room grew quiet, tension thick in the air. Derek felt a surge of frustration, but kept his composure. I understand your concern, he said, his voice calm but firm. But I complied with everything the officer asked. I did nothing wrong, and yet I was treated as if I were a criminal. That's the problem. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows this kind of treatment to happen in the first place. Linda stepped in, addressing the crowd. This isn't about attacking individuals. It's about addressing a culture and a system that create these situations. We're here to have a constructive conversation, to find solutions. The meeting continued, with residents sharing their own experiences and discussing ways to push for change. Ideas ranged from organizing bias training for officers to creating a community oversight board. While the discussions were heated at times, there was a shared determination to move forward. As the night ended, Derek felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. The community's support was a reminder that change was possible, even if it came slowly and with resistance. Back at home, Derek checked on Kira, finding her asleep with the bracelet still on her wrist. He sat beside her for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He thought about the kind of world he wanted her to grow up in, a world where she wouldn't have to fear the things he faced. The battle for justice and change was far from over, but Derek knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. For Kira, for himself, and for everyone who had stood with him that night, he was ready to fight for a better future. The days that followed the community meeting were anything but quiet. Derek found himself pulled into a whirlwind of activity. The video continued to gain traction online, sparking heated debates on social media and in news segments. Local outlets picked up the story, and soon national reporters began calling, wanting to dig deeper into the incident. The attention was overwhelming, and Derek often found himself questioning if he had made the right decision by stepping into the spotlight. At work, the atmosphere was tense. Some co-workers were supportive, offering quiet words of encouragement, while others seemed distant, unsure how to approach him. Derek overheard snippets of whispered conversations in the break room, discussions that made his stomach twist. Words like troublemaker and blowing things out of proportion floated in the air, spoken by people who didn't understand or didn't want to. He tried to focus on his tasks, but the weight of being constantly scrutinized was taking its toll. Meanwhile, Linda remained a driving force in rallying the community. She coordinated meetings, reached out to local leaders, and worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. Derek admired her determination, even as he felt drained by the constant pressure. Every time he thought about stepping back, Linda's words echoed in his mind. Change doesn't happen in silence. One evening, as Derek was tucking Kira into bed, she asked him a question that stopped him cold. "Daddy, why were the police mean to you? Did you do something bad?" Derek froze, his heart sinking. How could he explain the complexities of racism and systemic bias to a child who still saw the world in terms of fairness and kindness? He sat on the edge of her bed, searching for the right words. "No, sweetheart, I didn't do anything wrong," he said softly. "Sometimes people don't treat others the way they should because they make assumptions without really knowing them. But that's why it's important to stand up and show them a better way." Kira's small face scrunched in thought, and she nodded slowly. "Like how you stood up for me when those boys were mean at the park." Derek smiled faintly. "Exactly like that. But this time, a lot of people are helping too. We're all standing up together." Her eyes brightened, and she hugged him tightly. "Then I'm not scared, Daddy." Her words gave Derek a renewed sense of purpose. If nothing else, he wanted to show Kira that standing up for what was right was worth the struggle, no matter how hard it got. As the community's efforts gained traction, resistance began to mount. Some residents, particularly in wealthier parts of town, pushed back against the narrative, claiming the incident was being blown out of proportion. They'd argued that the officer was just doing his job and that the growing attention was unfairly tarnishing the police department's reputation. Tensions rose as these opposing voices became louder, often clashing with those advocating for change. Derek started receiving anonymous messages, some supportive, but others threatening. The most chilling one was a note slipped under his door late one night. It read, "Stop making trouble, or you'll regret it." Derek's heart pounded as he held the paper, his mind racing with fear and anger. He refused to let it deter him, but the threat lingered in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of how high the stakes had become. The police department, feeling the pressure of public scrutiny, announced a town hall to address the community's concerns. The event was set to be moderated by a local journalist and promised to be an open forum for discussion. Derek was invited to speak, along with Linda and other community members. The announcement stirred a mix of hope and anxiety. Hope that meaningful dialogue could lead to change, and anxiety about how the night might unfold. The day of the town hall arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. The auditorium was packed, with standing room only. People from all corners of the community had shown up, those demanding accountability, those defending the police, and those simply curious about the unfolding drama. Cameras lined the back of the room, capturing every detail for the evening news. Derek sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together. Beside him, Linda gave him a reassuring nod. "You're ready for this," she said quietly. "Just speak your truth." When it was his turn to speak, Derek walked to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to blur around him as he took a deep breath. He started by recounting the events of that night, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke not just about what had happened to him, but about the larger issues at play, the fear, the humiliation, and the deep-seated biases that allowed such incidents to occur. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of the room shift. Some faces showed understanding, others skepticism, and a few outright hostility. But Derek pressed on, determined to make his voice heard. When he finished, the room erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs. Before he could return to his seat, a man in the audience stood up, his voice cutting through the noise. "Why should we believe you?" he demanded. "You're just trying to make the cops look bad." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Derek. He stared at the man, his anger simmering but controlled. "I'm not here to make anyone look bad," he said firmly. "I'm here to tell the truth. What happened to me can happen to anyone, and that's why it matters. This isn't about blame, it's about fixing a broken system. The tension in the room was electric, the divide between the crowd growing more apparent. But Derek's words had struck a chord, and others began to speak up, sharing their own experiences and calling for action. The conversation was raw and unfiltered, a collision of perspectives that laid bare the community's fractures. By the end of the night, one thing was clear: the fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead would be anything but smooth. As Derek left the auditorium, he couldn't shake the feeling that the most intense moments were yet to come. As Derek stepped out into the crisp night air, the weight of the evening settled over him like a heavy blanket. The voices from the town hall still echoed in his mind, a chaotic mix of support, doubt, and resistance. He had faced the tension head-on, but there was no denying how deeply it rattled him. Linda walked beside him, her expression calm but focused, as though she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "You did well in there," she said, glancing at him. "You spoke from the heart, and people heard you, even the ones who didn't want to." Derek nodded, though the knot in his stomach hadn't eased. "I don't know if it'll change anything," he admitted. "It feels like for every person who supports us, there are 2 more waiting to tear us down." Linda stopped and placed her hand on his shoulder. "That's the fight, Derek. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts with standing your ground. And you're not alone in this." Her words brought a flicker of reassurance, but before Derek could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, the screen illuminating an unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello," he said cautiously. There was a brief pause on the other end before a voice spoke, low and urgent. "Mr. Reynolds, I don't have much time, but I need you to listen. I'm an officer with the department. I can't say who I am, but I saw what happened that night, and it wasn't right. The officer who pulled you over, he's done this before." Derek's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" The voice continued, each word laced with tension. "There are reports, complaints that were buried. He targets people like you, Derek. The department knows, but they've looked the other way. If you want justice, you need to dig deeper. There's more to this than you realize." Before Derek could ask any questions, the line went dead. He stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, his mind racing. The cryptic call felt like both a warning and a revelation, raising questions he hadn't thought to ask. What had been buried? How far did this go? And why had this stranger decided to reach out now? Linda noticed the shift in his demeanor. "What is it?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Derek hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "Someone just called me," said the officer. "That night has a history of doing this, but the department's been covering it up." Linda's eyes widened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "That changes everything, if we can prove it." "That's the problem," Derek interjected. "How do we prove it? Whoever called didn't leave a name, and I don't know where to start." Linda's mind was already working. "There's always a trail," she said firmly. "Complaints, reports, something. If this has been going on for a while, someone else has to know." The revelation lit a fire in both of them, and over the next few days, they dove headfirst into uncovering the truth. Derek reached out to others who had shared similar stories at the town hall, while Linda tapped into her network, contacting local activists and even a few sympathetic journalists. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, a web of incidents that painted a damning picture of the officer in question. But the deeper they dug, the more resistance they faced. Records were mysteriously hard to access, and some people they spoke to were reluctant to go on the record. It became clear that fear was a powerful silencer, and Derek began to understand just how much courage it had taken for that anonymous officer to make the call. One night, while sifting through pages of documents Linda had managed to obtain, Derek found something that stopped him cold. It was a report, heavily redacted, but the details were unmistakable. A similar traffic stop, almost identical to his, had taken place 3 years ago. The victim, a young black man, had filed a formal complaint, but it had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. The officer named in the report was the same one who had pulled Derek over. "This is it," Derek said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and determination. "This proves he's done it before." Linda leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the document. "It's a start," she said cautiously. "But it's not enough. We need someone who can confirm it, someone from the inside." Derek thought back to the call, the urgency in the stranger's voice. Whoever that person was, they had the answers he needed. But how could he find them without putting them at risk? Before he could dwell on it, another thought struck him. What if there are more cases? What if this isn't just about one officer? Linda's expression grew serious. "Then we're looking at a systemic problem. And that's going to be even harder to fight." As the scope of their mission expanded, so did the stakes. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. Derek began noticing strange cars parked near his house, and Linda received an anonymous email warning her to back off before it's too late. The threats only fueled their determination, but they also made it clear how high the stakes had become. The tension came to a head one afternoon when Derek received a knock on his door. He opened it to find a man in a plain suit standing on his porch, his expression unreadable. The man introduced himself as an investigator with the city's police oversight board. "We've received some troubling reports," the investigator said. "I'd like to speak with you about your incident and anything else you've learned." Derek's instincts screamed caution. Was this man here to help, or was he part of the system trying to silence him? The uncertainty hung heavy as he invited the investigator inside, his mind racing with possibilities. What Derek didn't know was that this meeting would set off a chain of events that would bring the conflict to its boiling point, forcing him to confront truths he wasn't prepared for and decisions that would change everything. Derek sat across from the investigator, his pulse quickening as he recounted the events of that night. Every word felt like he was walking a tightrope, unsure if this man was genuinely there to help or if he was yet another piece of a system intent on maintaining its silence. The investigator nodded as Derek spoke, occasionally jotting notes in a small, worn notebook. His face revealed nothing, no judgment, no agreement, just a steady focus that made Derek feel both cautious and hopeful. When Derek finished, the investigator leaned back slightly, tapping his pen on the edge of the table. "You're not the first to come forward about this officer," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "We've been watching him for a while now. The problem is, without hard evidence or credible testimony from within the department, it's been impossible to take action." Derek's stomach sank. He had hoped the investigator would bring clarity or a sense of immediate justice, but instead it felt like another roadblock. "So, what happens now?" he asked, trying to keep the frustration from his voice. The investigator hesitated. "If you're willing, we can use your case to reopen a formal inquiry. But I won't lie to you, it'll be a fight. People will try to discredit you, bury the evidence, and make this process as difficult as possible." Derek glanced at the kitchen table, where Kyra's bracelet lay beside a pile of documents. He thought of her smile, her future, and the promise he'd made to himself to protect her at all costs. "I'm in," he said firmly, "whatever it takes." Over the next few weeks, the investigation gained momentum. The anonymous officer who had called Derek finally stepped forward, agreeing to testify under the condition of strict confidentiality. Linda worked tirelessly to rally community support, organizing events that brought people together to share their stories and demand accountability. Slowly, more victims came forward, their testimonies painting a damning picture of systemic issues within the department. The night of the public hearing was electric with anticipation. The room was packed, filled with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. Derek sat at the front, flanked by Linda and the investigator, his heart pounding as he prepared to speak. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. He felt the weight of every person who had been silenced, every injustice that had gone unnoticed, and every child who deserved a safer world pressing down on him. When his name was called, Derek rose and approached the podium. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment palpable. He spoke from the heart, recounting his experience with a mix of vulnerability and determination. He described the humiliation, the fear, and the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. But he also spoke of the courage it had taken to stand up, the community that had rallied around him, and the hope that change was possible. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. For a brief moment, Derek allowed himself to feel a swell of pride and relief. But as he returned to his seat, the investigator leaned over and whispered something that sent a chill down his spine. "We've just received new evidence. Something big. It changes everything." The hearing continued as Derek tried to focus, his mind racing with questions. What evidence? Who had provided it? And why now? It wasn't until the meeting adjourned that the investigator pulled him aside and handed him a sealed envelope. "You need to see this," he said gravely. Inside was a series of internal emails, leaked anonymously, detailing a deliberate effort by higher-ups in the department to suppress complaints against the officer. The language was cold and calculated, with phrases like minimize public exposure and maintain departmental integrity, making it clear that protecting their image had been prioritized over justice. Derek felt a surge of anger as he read, but then something caught his eye. A name at the bottom of one of the emails. It was someone he recognized, someone who had publicly supported him during the investigation, the department's chief of community relations. Betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was a coordinated effort to protect the institution at all costs. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. News outlets picked up the story, and public outrage grew. Protests swelled in size, calling not just for accountability for the officer, but for a complete overhaul of the department's practices. The chief was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and a special task force was formed to review the department's handling of complaints. For Derek, the fight wasn't over. The tides were turning. He stood with Linda and Kira at a community rally, looking out at the sea of faces united by a shared determination for change. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Derek felt a sense of hope. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that could transform his community for generations to come. As the crowd cheered and chanted, Derek glanced down at Kira, who was holding his hand tightly. She looked up at him with a smile, her eyes bright with pride. "You did it, Daddy," she said softly. He squeezed her hand and nodded. "We did it.